Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to episode 43 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Amongst all the applications application discussions and all the discussions we have on a regular weekly basis, APIs, converged infrastructure, web scale apps, etc., kind of the overwhelming trend of all this is that systems are becoming more and more interconnected, and in some cases they're becoming more complicated or more complex. So today's guest, James Urquhart, a longtime friend of the show, we're glad to have him back, kind of an expert on this. So James, welcome back to the show. Well, glad to have you back on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Brian. Thanks, and really enjoy these conversations. So looking forward to this one.
So James, you were on. It's been probably 4 or 5 months. It was sort of last fall. Last time we were on, you were speaking from kind of the point of view of a lot of the work you were doing on OpenStack when you were at Cisco, but you've changed roles. What are you doing now, and what have you been doing for the last 4 or 5 months?
Since early December of 2011, I've been VP of Product Strategy for cloud management vendor enStratus, and we're basically the top enterprise-centric cloud management vendor from the perspective of consuming cloud services rather than from the perspective of delivering an IaaS service. So the way to think about enStratus is when you have applications you want to deliver to the cloud, how do you build operations around that product? How do you get a single pane of glass to deliver that application on one or more clouds? And then in the enterprise, what gets really interesting is the problem isn't just how do you deliver, a few processes around a few applications to thousands of cloud of nodes, like you would with, say, a Web 2.0 environment or a big data environment. The problem in enterprise gets really interesting because you actually have tens or hundreds or thousands of applications that are being delivered to the cloud infrastructure, each of which probably, if you average the whole thing out, probably are using 5 or 10 servers frequently, as opposed to hundreds or thousands. But the problem that you have is you're still overall using thousands of servers, and you now also have the additional scale problem of having thousands, tens or hundreds or maybe thousands of developers and operations personnel interacting with those clouds to run those applications. So our focus is, at enStratus, I've been thinking about this application operations problem for a long time. You can see on my blog where I've sort of really been breaking down the problem over a number of years to kind of really understanding cloud as an operations model, but cloud computing is an application-centric operations model primarily. And so I've been thinking about this problem about what does that mean? What are the capabilities you have to deliver? And I was an advisor for enStratus for quite a while, and this is the perfect opportunity for me to go and answer that question with one of the top emerging vendors in a very early emerging space right now that I honestly believe every enterprise is going to need, and very few of them, if any of them, really have today.
Okay. Well, first of all, congratulations on the new role.
Thank you.
So enStratus has been making a lot of noise in the market. I know we had George Reese, who was one of your founders and CTOs, on a number of months back. But before we sort of jump into enStratus, because I think there's one of the unique things about, say, what enStratus does, or the platform vendors who deliver management visibility to a lot of different clouds, both to a lot of different customers, is you guys are getting probably a very unique set of insight that's much layers deeper than we see in the media, on Twitter, on the social media, about what's going on with cloud. One of the reasons I love calling you up or talking to you is every 3 to 6 months or so, you kind of dive into some aspect of a topic. In the past, it's been, how do you deliver applications, and why is that different from what infrastructures did? Now, recently, you've been kind of focused on this system level thinking. We're dealing with more interconnected systems. So, like you said, an enterprise might leverage a bunch of in-house resources as a cloud, a set of cloud resources or segments of a cloud. They might try and interconnect that with a public cloud service, multiple public cloud services. So you've got a much more interconnected, complicated model now. You've been not only writing about it a lot on your blog, you're writing over on GigaOM, but you've been speaking about it. Give us kind of the insights. What triggered you to start diving into this form of thinking? What have been sort of the highlights that you're finding as you're digging more into this space?
Well, I became aware of complex systems and the science that's really been building over a number of decades around the systems level view of the world for quite some time. I read a book probably in I would say probably 2002 or 2003 that had actually already been out for a while when I read it about sort of the it's called Complex Systems, it's really taking a look at the history of the Santa Fe Institute, which is one of the great academic institutions that's studying this world. And it introduced me to how that world came to be. There's an amount of research on systems level thinking that goes back into the 40s with some work on cybernetics and some other pieces that have been written over the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s that looked at, stepping away from reductionist thinking, the kind of thinking that Newton introduced, where you try to break things down to their component parts and figure out how the component parts each do their thing, and then understand the science of each element and find root causes for specific phenomenon that you're seeing in the world and explain it in very detailed sense. So that you can come up with formulas that predict how this very closed system ultimately, this very closed view of the world ultimately behaves. In a systems level view, what was happening was in a lot of sciences, people were saying, the things that a reductionist thinking seems to suggest are going to be the case aren't always the case. A great example is in economics. You always had sort of the law of diminishing returns, but there are actually situations where there are increasing returns. For instance, if you look at what happened with VHS versus beta videotapes in the marketplace, and you look at how the one that got the most traction around movies and around video players early on had actually increased value to the market, so that it had an increased advantage over the one that didn't have that early play. And so there was actually an increasing return in the market for them. The more that they manufactured, the more that they produced, the better the market got for them, and the more it generated demand for increased awareness of content, of players, of stores that rented content and everything. So what, why was that was really sort of a fundamental question. And there began to be this identification that there are, when you have groups of individual agents that each react to the world around them according to a set of rules and some basic frameworks, and even better, potentially could learn from their past interactions to make determinations about how to behave the next time they interact with the same situations. What you have when you have these many agents interconnected with no centralized intelligence that's really trying to control the behavior of the system, you still have an emerging behavior for the system itself. So you have an emerging behavior for the economy, where you see patterns in the economy that are consistent about the checks and balances for different kinds of behaviors, but also runaway events that take place on occasion. You have that in biology, both in terms of evolution and ecosystems, but also breaking it all the way down to the way our bodies work and how cells interact to create this living, conscious entity that is us. You have it in societies. In fact, societies are very, very far along in a lot of ways compared to technology in their view of complex systems and how to think about the world in terms of systems. And so what came out of that for me was I began to look at what the internet was doing to software and how we were increasingly interconnecting our software across the board, and finding very quickly that the model we are beginning to build towards the way our entire computing infrastructure and the software running on it and the businesses consuming the software is increasingly becoming the kind of interconnected, many-agent, no centralized control thing that is a complex system. And it's very adaptive because developers are sort of the DNA of the system. They're going in and they're changing the way software works, or introducing new elements, new platforms, new concepts, and frequently to try to build a thriving world for their software in a highly competitive ecosystem. And so you have all of these sort of traits of complex adaptive systems starting to show up in software. And what that means ultimately is that the way you think about building an application and operating an application moves away from the siloed models that we were all very used to, where we just focused on the application and focused on how to make that application as stable as possible in the world that it's running. Okay. To this idea of the system itself having a resilience and having an existence that has to be maintained independently of the individual agents that are running into it, and that when you put your software in that world, you have to understand how your software can be resilient in the face of this ever-changing system that it's running in. Okay. And I did a presentation at GlueCon, on a keynote, where I sort of really laid out the case for why the world we're moving into is this complex adaptive systems world, and some basic things that you can do today, some practical advice today on things that you can do as you develop your next generations of applications, and to be able to address the systems model that you have to begin to address in this interconnected world.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll have a link in our show notes to the slides that you have presented. So for folks that want to go see what James presented, that'll be in there. I think a couple of things that I've kind of pulled out of reading what you've been writing about, looking at what you've been presenting, is it is, like you said, it is a very different way of thinking about things, because in the past it was, I know, let's take the software model, or the kind of IT-centric piece of this is, I know what my application, the environment that it's going to go into, I have a rough idea of how much capacity and usage it's going to expect to get, and so when you have a rough idea of the environment that it's in, you can kind of plan for certain scenarios. You can plan for spikes and peaks. You can plan for failure scenarios. But I think what you're really starting to hit on is, and again, there's corollaries to this in the economy and other things. When you start getting into an environment where the number of things you're interconnected to can get multiple layers away from your visibility. So you may not have any idea of how many API calls you're going to get, whether or not one single entity could, hammer your system at levels that you never expected because of popularity or because of, an attack, or the resources that you're dependent upon because you have an interconnected application. It's API driven, it's partnership driven, whatever. The things downstream from that you may not completely understand. And so I think a lot of what you're trying to highlight to people is, you have to be aware that this level of interconnectedness is far broader than you had before. You've got to start putting some different kind of thinking and tools in place to plan for, say, failures or spikes or inconsistencies that you didn't necessarily have to think about in closed systems. Right. Are those fair starting points for how people should start looking at what you've been diving into?
Yeah, I think that, so a couple of things that this world is driving already that are indicative of the kinds of changes that you need to begin to consider are, first of all, software is getting more granular, right? If you look at, from the perspective of you as a enterprise software, as an enterprise developer or as a software developer looking to interact in the world of cloud computing and leverage cloud's resources, but also cloud services in general, in a way that really lets you quickly enhance your business and be agile in terms of the way you address things, but at the same time minimize the amount of effort that you have to take in order to understand and run those services. You look at that situation and you begin to understand that, with things out there like, various Amazon services, like their, everything from RDS, their relational database service, to their billing services, to a bunch of other things that they have readily available. You look at things like Twilio, which we use in enStratus, and a number of the companies use for all things phone communications, and there's a number of companies kind of in that space. If you look at other services like Salesforce.com and what they do with Force.com, and your ability to build applications directly against a data set that's being created and managed ultimately by another application. What you begin to understand is that these pieces and parts are coming together in more granular ways. So there's more pieces and parts, not less. And each piece and part is actually simpler in some ways. Even if I consume Twilio, which is probably a very sophisticated application underneath, from my perspective, it's an API, and that API is actually relatively simple for me to develop to. And so the things we're building are becoming simpler, but the relationships those things have to the world around them are becoming more complicated and more sophisticated. And the thing to remember in a complex system is that if you want to thrive, you shouldn't trust anybody.
Okay.
You shouldn't believe that something will be available at all times. It's like the old, myths about the network stuff that Sun had put out some years ago. It's, you can't really, you can't make assumptions about what to trust. And so managing the relationships, building technology around managing the relationships between things, the relationships between your applications and the other applications that you own, relationships between your applications and the infrastructure they consume, your applications and the other third-party services that you may be consuming elsewhere. Managing those relationships both in the code so that the code is resilient to failures in those relationships to other things, but also in terms of the management environment that you apply to running applications in general, and understanding the how you manage the relationships between two things that may not have been developed to work together in the past. There's a whole bunch of opportunity there, and there's a whole bunch of work there that you have to begin to do. And the frame of reference that I use is not the only company in the world that's really good, but they're very public in what they do, is Netflix. And if you look at how they develop their application environments in Amazon to serve this massive audience that they have, what they do is an awful lot of things where they say, the developer's responsible for the survivability of and thriving of their own application components in the environment as a whole, that they build resiliency into the front pages that you hit when you use your devices to choose what movies you're going to do, in the way they interact with the streaming companies that they use, including their own CDN that they just launched, plus a bunch of the other CDNs they consume. What they're building for is not to say, here's my nice stable environment in which everything is duplicated to give me HA. What they're building is an environment that says, gee, if my personalization system for what movies I'm suggesting to you goes down, I have an alternative data source that will let me maybe serve up cache data. And if that's not available, then I have an alternative failover mechanism that lets me go to a general set of recommendations that I make generically to customers. And if I still can't get to that, I just don't draw that element on the screen at all.
Okay.
But in doing that, I think Amazon does something similar. Think about the last time you went to Amazon.com and you didn't get a page at all, right? It doesn't happen, and that's the resiliency, and that's the approach.
Okay. So one of the interesting things that happens is you're out in the heart of Silicon Valley. You're around folks all the time at hackathons and developer events and so forth that are kind of living and breathing this all the time. So to have this conversation with them may not seem, incredibly strange or incredibly new, right? They're getting bits and pieces of it. They've got colleagues who are doing those things. But a lot of other folks that aren't living in super web scale but would like to take advantage of some of these things. They're in Cleveland, they're in Dallas, they're in London. When you start having conversations with them and you say, well, you can't trust anything, and you start making these very broad, different kind of statements, there's got to be a point where they say, okay, so where do I get started? How do I start doing that? I got to imagine somewhere in there, because you have a tendency to align your interest in the things that you work on with the types of companies or the technologies you work on. Help me shift gears and put enStratus a little bit into that conversation. Now, enStratus, as we talked about, isn't really an application development company, but it is a cloud management, resource management, governance.
Right.
How do you guys fit into that conversation when you start off talking to people about this complexity of interconnectedness or things that you can't trust? What are the first steps that a set of tools like enStratus plays in that role?
Well, let me first say that we're very early in. So right now I'm having a discussion based on observation of the early growth of the cloud in a lot of ways. It seems like it's been everywhere, and I know it probably sounds kind of wacky to say early growth, but frankly, when you look at what the opportunity is in the long term and the the long tail of computing that hasn't been touched because it wasn't economically viable before now. We're in the early stages, and so when I talk about all these sort of things about not trusting the other end of the wire, some of that is application development and application architecture that should be considered anytime you do a cloud app, especially if it's interconnecting with other elements that you both own and don't own in the cloud. But part of it is beginning to look at how operations changes in the face of the cloud operations model. And a big part of that change is we're moving from a server-centric operations model where we would, really everything was about, I've got a computer, thinking very much along the lines of extending desktop computing metaphors into the data center by saying, I've got a computer, okay, what OS am I going to put on that computer? Okay, now that I have the computer in the OS, what applications am I going to install on that computer? All the identity was in terms of the machine, right? IP address was the identity of the machine, host name. All of the metrics we were using, CPU utilization, memory utilization, I/O, they're all from the perspective of the server itself, not necessarily the applications running on the server. The problem in cloud is I don't come to the cloud with a server. I come to the cloud with a set of bits that turns whatever cloud services I'm looking into an application for my business, something that meets a business need that I have. And so I'm bringing these bits. It could be data, it could be code, it could be config information, it could be policy. And I'm bringing that information to the cloud to basically run my business using cloud services. And so when you look at that, the operations model changes from sort of the traditional silos that were very infrastructure-centric, server, network, storage, those operations groups are becoming kind of now part of a smaller section of what's actually has to happen, which is looking at infrastructure operations, which includes facilities, the hardscape, plus some of the management and automation at the infrastructure level. Then you have the services that are being offered on that infrastructure. So you have operators that are running your IaaS service, running your PaaS service, running, maybe other applications that you're making available as a service. There are people that are running SAP where they're offering, self-service sign up for access to certain SAP capabilities and so on. And then you have those people that are running the stuff that you run on these services. And that's where you get into the folks that I call application operations, which are, the people who actually are running the stuff that you run in the cloud. So a great example of that is, to kind of go through those three layers is you have Amazon, which is an infrastructure operator, but they're also running a set of services, including EC2, S3, and others, that are the services that expose that infrastructure to provide needs for IT. You then have folks like Heroku that are additional service operators that are consuming Amazon services in running their service, but they also are offering a service ultimately to more end customers on the front end. And then you have those people that are writing Ruby applications or the various other languages that they're increasingly supporting that run in the Heroku environment. And those people then have to operate those applications. And when you have an increasing number of applications running Heroku, the problem of keeping track of what's running where and how they're related to each other becomes harder and harder. What enStratus is doing is really focusing on that application operations problem, that problem of how do you manage the stuff you want to run in the cloud against the cloud services that you want to consume to get those applications delivered. So we're really looking at a variety of things that are about how to decouple how you run the application from the services that you're consuming. And that includes basic provisioning of applications into infrastructure as a service environments, which we do a lot of today. So basically saying, I need an instance of a server, and I want to run this image on it. It's still relatively server-centric at the baseline level, but beginning to move into the area where you say, but, the way I organize those images and that data is from the perspective of the application that I'm running in the cloud. So that's one. Two, then, is that how do you automate that and begin to automate that across a wide variety of cloud services? And that decoupling of application operations from service operations lets you say things like, I want to build an application that runs across Amazon and Rackspace and my private cloud. and I want to use the operations tool to decide what runs where and how, and what the scaling rules and policy and configuration is that I need to worry about in each of those clouds that I'm consuming. And so enStratus acts as an aggregation point for the automation capabilities that you need for the cloud. And in addition to that, there's the governance problem that we talked about before, which is now, if I have everybody using enStratus as the console to access the cloud, how do I make sure that my tens or hundreds of development teams each have the right access to the right application capabilities and the right cloud service capabilities that they need to deliver what they have to without violating, a variety of things, including compliance, including internal corporate policy and so on. So that governance piece becomes really important, and we do things in enStratus that are really cool. Like we do action level access control, where you could do things like, say, this junior operator, he can start an instance of this type, but he can't stop one. Okay. Right. And then the last piece that we are looking at then is, if you're going to have this application operations environment that's decoupled from the services and is going to be a part of the enterprise operations environment, it really has to be open to the variety of different tools and services that you want to be able to consume. Because, again, if you have tens or hundreds of teams, they're each going to bring to the table either legacy stuff that they've been using, or they're going to, there's going to be new stuff that you want to be able to integrate over time. So we've been very careful to make sure we're highly integrated with different capabilities, and it's easy to integrate additional tools into what we do. So we support Chef and Puppet today, and we use their tools. We don't embed Chef and Puppet in what we do. We allow you to consume your Chef and Puppet environments in a completely, standard way in terms of how you would use those tools. Same thing goes for what we're beginning to do work on with different image catalogs that are available in the market and different monitoring and management capabilities. We want to be able to very easily make it just a point-and-click capability to integrate a variety of different tools in the environment, and then to give you the APIs, which we have today. We have a very full set of APIs, both APIs to act against enStratus, but also notification APIs to signal when we've taken an action as enStratus, that you can use to basically integrate with a wide variety of tools, everything from lifecycle management tools to your other management tools to your if you want to, your configuration manager, your change management database systems, and so on. And so those capabilities, that integration, that ability to integrate into your existing models and to evolve your operations models with enStratus as a part of your overall IT operations approach, is really important to what we do as well. And that allows you to begin to build an application level operations practice that is something that every enterprise is going to need with the cloud, but really nobody has looked at it that way. Very few companies have looked at it from an application perspective in the past.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the things that's sort of interesting when you talk about it, and when I sort of see the things that enStratus is adding, it's like you said, it's this very flexible model. So you want to leverage AWS, you want to leverage rack space, you want to leverage an OpenStack environment that could be running anywhere, a VMware environment, whatever those things might be. And again, it could also be above infrastructure as a service. It could be platform as a service, so a Cloud Foundry service or whatever. It's interesting because it takes a little bit different approach to what we heard for a while sometimes around when people would talk about hybrid clouds. So they talk about, well, hybrid cloud really means you've got private type of services that IT is running or whoever is running it, but it's basically like stuff inside the walls, and then when you've got certain use cases, a bursting type of use case or a need more capacity on a on-demand use case, you'd have to sort of match what you did in-house with what you did externally through a service provider. And what you guys are really saying is that might be all well and good. Somebody might want to do that, and you could manage it that way, but is that really the way you really want to have flexibility in how you manage these things? So you may want to give your developers purely a low cost type of option that is very simple set of services they can enable. You may want to go to give them a different set of options that they can do in terms of what they want to build that has more robust services built around it. And what you're really focusing on is this kind of consistent layer that lets you say, I'm going to give you access to enabling the resources. I'm going to make sure that I can wrap policies around that, either at a group level, a person level, so that we don't get ourselves into a lot of trouble. But you do take away some of those things that might limit somebody that says, well, we're only going to allow you to do that if you've got like on one side of the pipe and like on the other side of the pipe. You're sort of saying that's irrelevant. What's really important is that I can give developers the resources that they want with the kinds they want. I can give IT a level of control so that they can solve business problems, and the consistency is really at that kind of horizontal level across wherever the resources are.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's great description, but I wouldn't say that like versus like doesn't matter. What I would say is, the operations model that you apply to the resources and services that are available to you has to be able to take into account all those resources easily and actually simplify working with even potentially a very heterogeneous environment. The truth of the matter is, the operations model is not the images that you use, right? So, and it's not the tools that you use. It's not the operations model is ultimately the approach that you take towards the way you consume, the way that you deliver the applications you want to deliver and keep them running and make sure they perform and make sure that you do that in a cost-effective fashion. So what becomes very interesting there is if you step back and look at it from how you want to operate your applications, down to then, therefore, how do I consume resources to do that? When you take that top-down view of what's going on, you begin to see that, more and more stuff, you can abstract more and more stuff about the resources and the services you're consuming, and be consistent in the language and the verbs and the nouns that you use without resorting to a least common denominator approach to computing, right? So still allowing differentiation to come through from the different services, but when like is like, then in terms of the operations tasks, you can actually say, well, this is consistent. The way I provision a server is consistent. The way that I applied load balancing, there may be different capabilities that are made available to me, but generally how I apply load balancing is consistently described for me so that I don't have to relearn for every single provider. And so the short of that being that you have to solve the operations problem, whether across multiple clouds, whether or not hybrid cloud per se is your target. You have to be able to say that rather than having to go to 10 different 10 different screens for 10 different cloud providers and having to deal with the fact that if I want to move applications around or if I want to spread an application across multiple providers, I now have to deal with the differences between the providers explicitly. What you want to be able to do is sit back and say, well, my operations model is already set up for multi-cloud. My operations model is already set up for large multi-team environments. And now the question is, how can I begin to point that at the different services and capabilities I can consume? And, over time, our job as a tool that makes it possible for you to do that, our job over time is to make it easier and easier and faster and more agile for you to be able to address all the possible capabilities of cloud that your company might be able to benefit from without locking you in to a single approach, either a single pair of public and private providers that give you you must use this, these two instances in order to be able to deliver approach, or even, locking you out of new technology capabilities that may show up, say, a year from now or 2 years from now that may revolutionize things all yet again. We want to be able to say that, as long as you are understanding what are the components of an application and how you deliver that across, IaaS today is the primary focus, but we will certainly be looking at other service types like platform as a service and eventually software as a service. How do we maintain a consistent approach to how we deliver that? And so when we train someone on how to do operations in our world, whether it's a developer or an operations professional, when we train them, it's really easy for them to apply what they've learned across a wide variety of cloud services in a consistent fashion. And that's really, it doesn't mean that we magically make any pain of cloud consumption go away, because there are always going to be differences and things that you have to address. But what we will say is that the ability to do that integration the ability to leverage what we've built or what our community begins to build around the types of technologies that are made portable across cloud providers or made optimized for a specific cloud provider or anything along those lines. That ability is what our job. Our job is to expose that and make that as easy for you to consume and consistent for you to consume as possible, while still giving you the full benefit of all the cloud services you may want to consume.
Okay. Very good. Well, listen, last quick question. I'm just sort of trying to get a temperature reading, I guess, because you get a chance to get out and talk to a lot of customers that are pushing the envelope on this, that really want to solve business problems with new ways of looking at applications and operations. Last week there was an outage with Amazon. It was about 5-6 hours, however long it was. We had a similar one 6, 7, 8 months ago. The one last year was everybody was up in arms. It was, oh my gosh, the cloud can't do this and Amazon can't do this. The one last week seemed to be like a kind of a minor sort of tremor as opposed to an earthquake. Do you, just as a temperature reading, do you get the sense people are becoming more and more comfortable that the cloud is what it is? It's got the characteristics that it does, some good and some bad, and people are beginning to adjust to that, and in some cases learning the right ways to deal with it, whether it's tools or operations or whatever, or are we still a long way from them really getting it?
Well, now we get into the whole difference between, a company that is online for a living and consuming cloud for a living versus a company that is, that where IT is looking at cloud as a way to either address agility or cost management or something along those lines. I would say that there's a class of companies out there. Typically, I call them Web 2.0, and there's some of the big data and analysis companies as well that learned a big lesson with the first Amazon outage. Some of them survived, but scrambled like crazy to do so. Some of them didn't survive, but realized that that you can't make assumptions about when you read what Amazon says. You can't make assumptions about how strongly they mean it. It's not that Amazon lied. Amazon's very clear about you should use multiple regions, you should use multiple availability zones. But people thought, more than one availability zone was enough. And those companies that were burned by that depended on running on the cloud in order to be a business, made the changes they need to make. And this time around, you had far fewer companies run into those issues. In fact, some of the companies that did run into issues, they're kind of beginning to land on a hall of shame because they really ought to have learned from the previous experience, and they seemingly didn't. So I think what on the enterprise side, though, I'm beginning to hear talk about engineering new applications in different ways so that they can take advantage of the cloud and cloud models more successfully. But to be really honest, unless it's an online portion of a business, most enterprises haven't really pushed their need for general enterprise software yet to the point where they've done the things they need to survive an Amazon outage outright. So I think in some ways you don't have all the players at the table yet that would really have yelled and screamed. But at the same time, people have learned lessons from each of these, and they're designing differently so that there's less of an impact. Each outage has less of an impact overall on the market than the one before it.
Okay, well, very good. So we're making some progress, even if sometimes it's only part of the industry or it's a little slower, but we're making some progress. So
I think something's going to happen technically in the next year or two, maybe 3, that is going to finally move where. So in enterprise is interesting in this market because in a lot of ways this is the first major transition to computing where enterprise trails the rest of the other markets completely. So they trail consumer in terms of cloud adoption. They trail government in general from cloud adoption. So what I think you're going to see is you're going to see some combination of factors come together, including the budget finally showing up and the initiatives finally getting mature enough within the enterprise that are going on today, plus new technologies, new service offerings, new lessons learned about architecture and tools that incorporate those lessons learned, that will cause a very, very strong shift in application development and deployment in the enterprise. Towards a public cloud first model, most likely. Although private cloud will always be there, and I think private cloud has a strong purpose. But I think you'll start to see people sort of saying that it's actually easier to turn out successful applications for the enterprise in a cloud model and even a public cloud model at some point in time. And when that happens, all this discussion about outages and unless there's pure negligence on the part of a cloud provider, I think outages will be, it's just part of the game. What are you complaining about, kind of stuff,
Right. Well, very good. Well, James, with that, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. Thank you so much for the time, as always. We're out of time for the week. James, for people that want to follow what you're working on or find you out and about in the industry, where can they find you? Where can they follow the things you're writing or keep up with you or connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, on Twitter, I'm very active. It's just James Urquhart, first name, last name, together as one string. I welcome anybody to follow me and interact with me directly there. I enjoy conversations online quite a bit. I'm also writing, not as frequently as I'd like, but I'm writing pretty frequently for GigaOM on their cloud coverage. So gigaom.com/cloud. It's a great place to find me there. And there's an author page for me as well, and I'm sure Brian will include the link for that. And then the last good place to find me is at a number of cloud events. I'll be at Structure next, or actually this week, I guess. It's all going by so fast. But and then I'll be at a number of events late this summer and in the fall timeframe as well. I welcome people to walk up, introduce themselves, be a part of the conversation. Ongoing, and especially as we dig into this what complex systems means to the way we operate applications in the cloud. People who have insights on that, I'd love to hear from you and converse with you that way. And then I'm at enStratus, and people can contact me there, first name last name at enStratus.
Okay, very cool. Well, folks, we're going to wrap it up for the week. Thanks again to James. You can follow us on Twitter at @thecloudcastnet or reach us on the web at thecloudcast.net. You can check out all the updates to the website, our YouTube channel, and as well as links to the show, how to download the show on iTunes and Stitcher. And thanks again for listening, everybody.